street.
I lived in a house that I called the House from Hell for 4 years, from age 11 to almost 16. There was constantly something happening. Doors flying open and shut, voices, footsteps. Nothing ever stayed where you put it. I was alone there a lot because both my parents worked and I was constantly terrified. One of the most gut-level disturbing things, though, was the little girl in my bathroom. Every time I walked past my bathroom door, which was constantly since it was right outside my bedroom, I saw a little girl with blonde curled hair and a rose-colored dress. She just stood there, staring, looking like a photograph from 1905. I started keeping the door closed so I could walk by without seeing her, but she was always there when I opened it. Once I stepped in past her. I couldn't see her anymore, but I could feel her there. She scared me, but I felt really sorry for her because she was trapped there, just like me, but probably forever. As the years went by, and things in the house continued to get worse, she started seeming darker. I started feeling like she wasn't really a little girl. I knew there was something ugly in the house, and I felt like it was presenting this sympathetic image to me. Then I started thinking maybe I was completely losing my mind. One day, when I was 14, I had a friend from out of town come stay with me for a week. I hadn't told her anything whatsoever about the house because I didn't think she'd come if I did. Right after she got there, we were sitting in my room and she left to go to the bathroom. About a minute later, she walked back in with a puzzled look on her face and said, "So, there's a little girl in your bathroom." Yeah, she hangs out in there. Blonde hair, curls, pink dress? Yeah. You know that's not really a little girl, don't you? I almost threw up. I was so relieved and terrified and excited and ready to run out of the house screaming. She wouldn't use my bathroom the rest of the week, and I started to use it as little as possible, without pissing off my parents who didn't want to believe. Eventually we moved out, and I couldn't have been happier. I distanced myself from it mentally as much as I could. Then, when I was 18, I took another friend on a road trip to pack up a few things that I'd left in the house. My parents hadn't managed to sell it, and wouldn't for 5 more years. The minute we got on the property, my friend seemed uncomfortable. When we came around the bend in the long, steep driveway, he went completely white. I could tell something was wrong, but he insisted he was okay, so we got to work. After a while, he asked to use the bathroom, and I directed him to mine. Not even 20 seconds after he left, he came running back in, gasping for breath, and slammed the bedroom door behind him. He started babbling about a little blonde girl who isn't really a little girl. All of a sudden, he went dead still, looked me in the eye, and very solemnly said, "She's not happy with you. You left, and you weren't supposed to." After that, we threw whatever we could grab in 2 trips into my car, and I walked him to another bathroom and waited outside the door, and we got the hell out of there as fast as we could. When I was younger, my uncle bought a property in the country for the purpose of raising crops. It was sprawling green land of over 40 acres, with a homestead out the front where my uncle and his family lived. A strange part of the property included an abandoned farmhouse toward the back, which my uncle had blocked off. At a family reunion one year, when I was 12, I overheard the adults talking about the farmhouse's history. Apparently, the original owner had slaughtered his family, and even the family pets. My uncle had some dairy cows, horses, and 2 cattle dogs, all of which refused to venture near the farmhouse. I heard him tell my parents that even rodents and insects couldn't be found there, within a 50-foot radius. My 11-year-old cousin and I were fascinated with the stories, and secretly we planned to investigate the next day. Even though we both delighted in telling and listening to scary stories, we were a little apprehensive. Our parents had warned us to stay away, but we snuck off and pretended that we were going to visit the horses. After wandering around, deliberately taking our time, we were soon climbing over the stile and facing the farmhouse. We'd both been chattering and enjoying each other's company, but now the looming building lulled us into silence. It was strange that a misty fog was settled around the farmhouse, and a strong sense of foreboding came over me. My cousin was braver than I was, and she took off before me, shouting over her shoulder, "Come on, chicken." I swallowed the lump in my throat and followed suit, although I dragged my steps and felt the darkness come over me. As we approached, the stillness made me shiver, while the boarded window suggested that evil was contained within. I stopped at the front steps while my cousin raced onto the porch. She turned and waved me over to join her. "You go in first," I said. She rolled her eyes and put her hand on the doorknob, but then she yanked her hand away in fright. Although afraid, I was annoyed with her. "What's wrong?" I asked. She shook her head and turned the knob. Soon, I was right behind her, and we slowly stepped in. The door creaked loudly, and the heavy air swallowed us up. The building was soon silent, and we moved towards the stairs. Neither of us spoke, due to the overwhelming fear. We jumped when all of a sudden a dog barked, like an echo. Then a shot rang out from what sounded like a void within a memory. We were then distracted by a creepy creaking noise, which made our flesh crawl and the hairs on the back of our necks stand up. My cousin whispered, "What is that?" before turning to look behind us. She began to scream, and her eyes widened. I turned to follow her gaze and saw a woman hanging from the dusty chandelier. We raced upstairs to escape. We could barely breathe, now crying and clinging to each other. Then more screams came from one of the bedrooms. Trembling uncontrollably, we saw a little boy and girl race out of the room, covered in blood. After that, we bolted straight out the front door, past the hanging woman, all the way back to my uncle's house. We didn't tell anyone, for fear of what would happen to us if we did. For many years, my wife, my brother, and I have enjoyed getting into the great outdoors, which includes a lot of hiking and fishing, especially for my brother, who considers himself kind of an expert in fly fishing. When we camped by a beautiful, secluded river last spring, he was ecstatic. My wife and I woke up early one morning and decided to go for a hike and do some wild strawberry picking. Naturally, my brother decided that he wanted to try his luck again and fly fishing the pristine river. The day turned out to be glorious, so we decided to keep hiking and picking, while my brother continued fishing. It was almost twilight when we returned to camp, and as soon as we arrived, I had a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Our tents were undisturbed, and nothing seemed out of place, apart from the fact that my brother was missing. I found his line and gear on the banks of the river, and slowly, panic started creeping in. We searched high and low, well into the night, using our flashlights. Just as we were about to give up and call the authorities, we heard yelling coming from the river. We scrambled down the mountain and past the tents, then skidded to a stop when we saw something emerging from the water. At first, it looked like a mud monster staggering out from the water and then falling to its knees. But then my brother's voice groaned loudly, and we knew that it was him. I yelled to my wife to get a blanket while I ran over to my brother. That's when I noticed that he was completely naked. He was covered in mud, but when I told him to go with me to the river to wash it off, he screamed no. My wife and I looked at each other, not knowing what had happened, as he wouldn't speak after that. We wrapped him in the blanket and sat him in front of the fire. It took a while before he told us what had happened. We had left to go hiking and he'd started setting up to fish when he heard something in the middle of the river, like a gurgling sound. Thinking it was either a drowning animal or a freak whirlpool, he put on his waders and made his way into the water. He said that the last thing that he remembered was being dragged under. While we listened to his story, he began to shudder and shake his head, like he was trying to shake off a terrible memory. When we pressed him to go on, he finally blurted that he had been attacked by a monster. My wife and I looked at each other, obviously thinking the same thing, that he was hallucinating. We gave him a warm cup of cocoa and soon he fell asleep. The next morning, I was able to take him to the edge of the river to wash the mud off. My blood froze when I saw his body. It was covered in horrible scratches, gouges, and bite marks. He looked like he was covered in bizarre markings. There were strange circular rashes on his torso, which he explained while sobbing that they were marks left by the monster's tentacles. There were strange scratches up and down his legs, like he'd been hit repeatedly with a whip, and many deep cuts. The freakiest wounds were the bite marks, which looked more like he'd been bitten by large bird beaks. As we cleaned him up and administered first aid, we heard a strange, gurgling, bubbling sound coming from the river. Sean started screaming and racing up the mountain before he even got dressed. I jumped up and started packing our gear without even checking out the creepy sounds. I told my wife we weren't waiting to find out what that was. Let's go. It wasn't long before we caught up to my brother and were back to safety. All three of us still don't have the guts to go back and figure out what happened that day, or what unholy creature lives in that river.